The NDP took over Jack Layton's state funeral, turning it into a political rally. Seriously, one of the creepy eulogies even called for negotiating with the Taliban. That's tonight on The Source. Jack Layton finally had his funeral on the weekend. I say finally because the NDP campaign team sent his deceased body on one last campaign tour. From Toronto to Ottawa to Quebec, back to Ottawa, and then back to Toronto. It wasn't a family funeral, of course. For some inexplicable reason, the Conservative government gave Layton a state funeral. I don't say inexplicable because the government's Conservative and Layton was NDP. I say inexplicable because Layton clearly did not meet the standard for a state funeral. A funeral for someone whose successes transcend our national divides, who unite us all and benefit the state itself. Layton was not that. He was a hyper-partisan politician whose largest achievement was becoming the leader of the opposition, but tragically not even sitting in Parliament for a day in that capacity. Becoming the leader of the opposition is not a great achievement in Canada. It's a nice way of saying you lost the election. No one says, I'm going to grow up and become the leader of the opposition one day. It's a transitional job. We've had no fewer than 15 leaders of the opposition just in the last 20 years. I bet you have to even think for a moment before you can name our current leader of the opposition. By the way, it's Nicole Turmel, and I promise you she'll be replaced within a year with someone new. Should she be given a state funeral too? There have been 3 state funerals in the past decade, Pierre Trudeau and 2 governors general, Ray Titian and Romeo LeBlanc, and I think that's about right. In the year 2000, hockey legend Rocket Richard was given a state funeral by the province of Quebec as one of the greatest hockey players in that province's history and a transcendent Quebec hero. He embodied the spirit of the whole province, not just one faction of it. Over 100,000 Quebecers showed up for his funeral. It was clearly a nonpartisan celebration. Not so for Layton's funeral. Just like everything else in the past week, it was handled by the NDP's partisan spin doctors. Even the eulogies were hyper-partisan. Before Layton's children were even allowed to speak, the NDP trotted out their party's spin doctor, Carl Belanger, and an old career NDP hack named Stephen Lewis. State funeral? What state funeral? There were no voices from the government or the state or the Queen. There were no voices that weren't vetted by the NDP. It wasn't a state funeral. It was an NDP funeral paid for by taxpayers, which, when you think about it, is a perfect fit for the NDP. Anne McGrath, Jack Layton's former chief of staff, admitted last week that the purpose of the funeral was indeed political. Unlike Rocket Richard's mass appeal, Layton's funeral was concentrated in the political media industrial complex, basically NDP activists around Toronto and their chorus in the Toronto Media Party. Of course the CN Tower was bathed in orange light. The CN Tower is owned by taxpayers. But it was turned into a political prop for the NDP. Again, a perfect symbol for that party, but also a symbol of just how internecine and clubby the media political elite is. Jack Layton and the NDP didn't win only a handful of seats in the West and Northern Canada and just 20 seats in Ontario. The big win of theirs was in Quebec with candidates like Ruth Ellen Brazeau, who spent the campaign down in Las Vegas. What I'm saying is this was no massive breakthrough. This was on a massive countrywide moment. It was a media moment, a government labor union moment, a Toronto elites moment, an NDP moment, but for the CBC NDP, it was the moment to set your watches to. No, to set your entire calendar to. Jack Layton was our new Christ. This is now year 1 in our country's political reckoning. But it's not true. I mean, the streets were not lined. A few thousand NDP CBC stalwarts showed up for the funeral, not the 115,000 who came for Rocket Richard, for example. And take a look at what the crowd looked like. Look at the crowd inside the theater there. Not representative of the country or even of Toronto, which is a majority minorities. I watched intently, and frankly, the only non-white face I saw in the theater was Olivia Chow, his widow. This was not a grassroots gathering. This was a gathering of the NDP. It was a gathering of labor union bosses and CBC hangers-on, most actually billing the taxpayer to be there. It wasn't a public funeral. It was not a state funeral. It was the NDP campaign team coming to hear a campaign speech. Now, if you think I'm overdoing it, well, you're wrong. I'm actually downplaying it. Let's look at the grotesque eulogy given by Stephen Lewis, former NDP hack, a man who spent his entire life on the public payroll. And yeah, before you ask, Lewis is the father of Avi Lewis, the CBC leftist who was scooped up by Al Jazeera television. Anyway, enough of me. Let's go to Stephen Lewis and his partisan rant at taxpayers' expense, pretending to be a eulogy at a state funeral. Roll the first clip, please.
Never in our collective lifetime have we seen such an outpouring, so much emotional intensity from every corner of this country. There have been occasions historically when we've seen respect and admiration, but never so much love, never such a shocked sense of personal loss.
Never in our lifetime? Such love? Never? Really? Well, I know that this funeral was the first time the NDP have thought about saints and heaven in a long time, but a few years ago a real saint did come to Toronto. I'm talking about Pope John Paul II. Instead of drawing 2,000 NDP hacks, the Pope drew 500,000 people without tax money. I'm talking about Pope John Paul II. There have been some emotional moments in this country, like emotional funerals for fallen policemen and fallen soldiers, and even the spontaneous tens of thousands of Canadians who came out in solidarity with America being attacked on 9/11. But of course, soldiers and policemen and the Pope and the United States don't count in the world of radical socialists like Lewis. They're nobodies. Layton is the new Christ. Lewis continued in his eulogy by listing Layton's achievements. Trouble's this: Layton really didn't have too many, other than coming in second in the last election, an achievement that we reward properly already with the title Leader of the Opposition. We don't give state funerals to people who win or lose campaigns. The election itself is the prize to be won or lost. Layton ran for mayor in Toronto 20 years ago, but he was crushed. So he was a city councillor, one of 44 of them for a long time. So here's how Lewis had to gloss over this enormous lack of achievement. Look at this.
In those early days of municipal politics in Toronto, Jack took on gay and lesbian rights, HIV and AIDS, housing for the homeless, the White Ribbon campaign to fight violence against women and consecrate gender equality once and for all. And of course, a succession of environmental innovations, bike lanes, wind power, the Toronto Atmospheric Fund. And now Michael, his progressive and talented son as councillor, can carry the torch forward. And then came his tenure as president of the Canadian Federation of Municipalities, where he showed that growing deftness of political touch in uniting municipalities of all sizes and geographic locations, winning their recognition of the preeminence of cities and the invaluable pillar of the public sector. Jack made the leap. Jack made the leap to federal politics look easy.
Okay, so let's sum up. Lots of speeches, some bike lanes, that lonely, sad windmill down at the Canadian National Exhibition. Layton was the president of a group of aldermen called the Federation of Municipalities, basically aldermen lobbying for more tax dollars from Ottawa. Sorry, that is not a record of achievement. That is a record of self-importance, of speechifying, but it's a perfect fit for Stephen Lewis, a lifelong NDP hack who himself has never had a position of executive responsibility. Lewis and his politician father and his journalist hack son have all spent their lives on the public teat, or the Al Jazeera teat, disparaging others but not actually doing a damn thing themselves. But let's get to the heart of Lewis's partisan speech. Lewis basically drops any pretense of nonpartisanship, or that perhaps he should rise above politics during a so-called state funeral. Lewis doesn't do that. He outlines why he thinks Layton is a saint and what this is really all about. Layton had the right opinions. That's really all that could be said about him. Besides losing elections, he had opinions that the CBC thinks we all must share. Check it out.
He talks of social justice, healthcare, pensions, no one left behind, seniors, children, climate change, equality, and again that defining phrase. And again, that defining phrase, a more inclusive and generous Canada. All of that. All of that is entirely consistent with Jack's lifelong convictions. Same deeply held principles of social democracy that made him a superb politician at the city level, as I know, transferred brilliantly to federal politics, and also, from the many wonderful conversations we had together, I know led him to a formidable commitment to internationalism. He was fearless in his positions once embraced. Thus, when he argued for negotiations with the Taliban to bring the carnage in Afghanistan to an end, he was ridiculed but stood firm. Now, it's conventional wisdom.
Could you imagine using a funeral, a state funeral, to argue for negotiating with the Taliban? And did you hear the whoops and applause there? Woo! Negotiate with the terrorists. Can you even imagine talking about a terrorist group at any funeral? Or global warming or pension plans? I mean, he basically went through the NDP platform. What a sick, sick man. Who would do that at a funeral? Actually, I'm not being fair. Lewis didn't hijack the funeral for partisan purposes. He was chosen by the NDP spin doctors and campaign scripters precisely because he's a partisan hack. That was not a rogue eulogy. Let's look at that Taliban clip one more time.
Thus, when he argued for negotiations with the Taliban...
Gross! No state funerals for our troops actually killed by the Taliban, but a state funeral in which the NDP expresses his support for talking to the terrorists who murder our troops. But here's the best part. Look at this.
Jack understood that we are headed into even more perilous economic times. He wanted Canadians to have a choice between what he described as the unfairness of an economy that excludes so many from our collective wealth and an economy that would embrace equity, fairness, balance, and creative generosity. This was the essence of the manifesto.
And, and right after that, there was a standing ovation, and the CBC cameraman instantly turned the shot to Prime Minister Stephen Harper just to make sure he was joining in the applause for a call for a socialist manifesto. I mean, who even uses the word manifesto anymore other than Karl Marx or the Unabomber? This was not, look, they tune it, look, when's he standing? When's he standing? Yeah, you're damn straight. They take notes about who's the last to stand. This was not a funeral. It was a redo of the last election campaign, paid for with your tax dollars and with Jack Layton's dead body as a political weapon. The whole idea here was to say outrageously partisan things, outrageously socialist things. But if you dared to criticize, or in the case of the PM there, if you dared not to applaud, if you dared not to stand up, you would be accused of being unsympathetic to a dead man. Don't take it from me, take it from David Suzuki, who boasted about just that moment in the Toronto Star. He said this about Harper having to stand up, quote, "He had to stand up with the rest of us," said Suzuki with a chuckle, according to the Star. Got it? This wasn't a nonpartisan funeral. This wasn't about a man's achievement. This wasn't a funeral for every Canadian. This wasn't even a funeral for every Torontonian. This was a funeral for the CBC NDP groupthink. This was a funeral that celebrated one set of views about the Taliban and global warming and government-funded pensions. This was a funeral by government-funded hacks for government-funded hacks. Jack Layton did not deserve a state funeral. The NDP should not have been given millions of dollars worth of assets and public money for a pep rally. Stephen Lewis's disgraceful eulogy was the perfect icing on that privileged, tax-funded, entitled, self-absorbed cake.